welcome to another edition of Community Issues. I'm your host, Omar Rashada. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and so I'm here once again, as I do every year, to do an educational informative show on domestic violence. And I have three distinguished guests with me today. I have a survivor of domestic violence, Marie Lopez. I have the Executive Director of the Delaware Coalition Against Domestic Violence, Ms. Sue Ryan. And I have Ms. Megan O'Reilly, who is the lawyer for Community Legal Aid. Good morning, ladies. How are you?
Good morning, Omar.
Okay, let's start with the Executive Director. All right. What is domestic violence? We were talking about before the show that some people may be experiencing domestic violence but may not know what it is. So what is the domestic violence and some of the forms, different types of domestic violence?
Domestic violence involves different type of tactics, from physical abuse to emotional abuse, like calling persons names and putting them down, psychological abuse, making somebody feel really bad about themselves, financial abuse, controlling whether or not you get a job, ruining your job or ruining your credit so you're stuck with this person. It can be sexual violence. It can be threats of hurting you, like getting up in your face, never actually hitting you, but making you afraid. It's all of these tactics with the purpose of control. The whole point of these actions is for the abuser to have control and power over the other person.
You know, when one starts off in a relationship, the female may say, when we first met, he was such a kind gentleman. He took me out. He brought me roses every week. He took me to the movies. And there may be some hidden signs of what the abuser is that the person that's being abused may have missed. So any one of you three ladies can chime in. What are some of the warning signs of an abuser? Then I'm going to go into what are some of the warning signs of what a victim is, because some people may not know someone's being a victim of domestic violence.
I'm so glad you asked that question, Omar, because I think sometimes people, they really judge victims of domestic violence. They'll think, well, why didn't you just leave him? This is someone you fell in love with. This was your boyfriend, your partner, the father of your children, and it does start out in a romantic way. That is actually all part of the control. Okay. It's pulling you in, it's tying you in emotionally, and now you have children together, you have this relationship together, and then it can turn quickly into violence, or it can take years where it builds up over time. And it can be so confusing, because again, this is someone that you care about, it's your partner, it's the father of children, and you're thinking, what is happening right now? And it can be really, really difficult to recognize.
There's not any particular signs that you may see. We all have flaws. As humans, we all have flaws. And we make excuses for them. That's one of the major things an abuser does. You isolate the situation and say, well, it was because of X, Y, Z. And you don't really see that as a whole personality trait as opposed to something situational. And that's how you're able to overlook them. And when you look at the big picture, that's when you see them as an abuser. But on the inside, it's hard to see the big picture.
Right.
And I think that, to the outside world, abusers may come off as very charming. And so somebody who doesn't have a lot of training on how to separate, maybe a police officer who's new and who hasn't been trained, although I think they're getting a lot of training now to be trauma informed. But somebody who's not trained to interview correctly and separate a survivor or victim from an abuser, asking the right questions about lethality to figure out whether or not there's a risk involved, might not be able to see that, the person who's been abused, who's reacting kind of violently themselves, has been abused, and the person the abuser, who's reacting in a very charming way, is actually committing abuse. So it's hard to give you a good answer as to what is the sign. It's really a difficult question.
Right. Marie, you and I know each other, man, going back to probably 2000, 2001. You were in my play family. And throughout the years that I've known you, I never knew that you were a victim of domestic violence. And there was two other women that I've interviewed on Numerous Cases that shared with me that they're victims of domestic violence. Ms. Ryan pointed out earlier, people ask, why'd you stay? So as a survivor of domestic violence, and for those who want to say, well, she must like it, she shouldn't leave him. It's kind of like they're blaming the victim. So we're going to talk about blaming the victim in a few minutes, but for you being a survivor, experiencing domestic violence, why did you stay?
I think one of the main things I want to point out is, as a society, we're too focused on why did the victim stay, as opposed to why was the abuser abusive.
Right.
I don't hear anyone asking those questions. I stayed for various reasons. Had children, financial reasons. Because of my children, how was I going to just walk out the door with nothing but the clothes on our back and give them a better life than what we already had?
Right.
We always sacrifice, because he wasn't abusive to the children at that time. So we sort of sacrifice ourselves for a better life for our children. They never knew what was going on, or so I thought. We never knew what was going on. And then after the fact, you step outside and you see the bigger picture, but while you're in it, myself, I had a son from my previous marriage, and I felt almost embarrassed that this man I brought into our lives turned out to be so horrible. So I kept trying to make excuses, kept trying to fix it, kept trying to change myself or my situation to make him happy, to make the situation better. I just felt it was my burden to bear. And it wasn't until years later, 2 children later, that I realized, okay, at this point now, how am I setting a good example for my children? I don't want them to grow up and think this is what a man is supposed to be.
Right. Mr. Ryan, I'm quite sure you probably have similar cases with the victims that come in the doors of the Delaware Coalition Against Domestic Violence. You do hear some similar stories like Marie's.
Yes, and I really appreciate what Marie said, that the emphasis is too often on why the victim stayed as opposed to why is the abuser doing this. And the blaming is not okay. And I think it's also important to realize that domestic violence can take many different forms. It isn't always going to be financial and emotional and psychological and physical. Right. Sometimes it's any one of those. And I think that it's important also to recognize that for many victims, the reason that they stay is the fear of the children, that the abuser will take the children. And when you're experiencing that type of abuse and control, that person seems really overwhelming. And it can feel like, even though you know, well, there's a court system and there's help out there, you're trying to figure out what's the safest way for me to get help and not lose my children. So there's a lot of safety planning and calculation that the victim has to figure out. And it's so important for the victim of domestic violence to know that they're not alone. Unfortunately, in Delaware and across the country, it is a very, very common thing that's happening in families. 1 in 4 women, 1 in 12 men, because men are also victims of violence, are experiencing this type of violence. And it can be for years a lot of emotional and psychological control, and then it turns into financial control, and then becomes a lot of threats and intimidation, and then maybe even physical and sexual violence. Every situation is going to be unique, but it's really important that no matter what that situation is, there are resources available for people.
And I'd like to piggyback off of that, because in my situation, when you're dealing with so much, you don't know what resources are out there. I didn't know there was help. So you're thinking, me, how can I do this on my own? I had no idea what resources, and we keep it a secret. So it's not like I told people and they were able to give me those resources. I just didn't know.
And then speaking of resources, Megan, you work for the Community Legal Aid. What is it that your agency do for victims of domestic violence?
So Community Legal Aid Society represents victims of domestic violence in a few different ways. In Newcastle County, Delaware Volunteer Legal Services represents victims of domestic violence to file for civil protective orders to the extent that they can. But what you should understand is that 80% of victims go unrepresented because there's just a lack of funding for those, for those victims, for those survivors. Community Legal Aid Society represents the victims and survivors in Kent County and Sussex County on protective civil orders.
Okay.
Those are like stay away orders to get when people come in and they say, I need a protection order so that this person stays away from me, I need them to stay away. But that's just like the start of where they need help, because we need resources to help people, and we can help them to continue to have help when it comes to like custody, because the abuse doesn't end there. You know, as Sue was talking about, the power and control, it continues. I mean, there might be financial abuse where we need to help them in matters of asking for support that goes on because they haven't had access to financial resources, or we need to help them get a custody order so that the abuser can't continue to exercise, control over them through children. Or it might be an immigrant victim who has, status in the country tied to the abuser, and that person has been saying, I'm going to call the government and have them send you back, and you're never going to see your children again, or something of that sort. And so there are so many things that Community Legal Aid and other organizations can do to help if we have the resources. So we can do those things if survivors call us, but there's a limit to what we can do. So 80% of people do go unrepresented, and as you were saying, you didn't even know some of those resources existed. So I'm glad that we're doing this so that we can raise the awareness and let people know that we're out there to help. And that's just some of the things that we do.
We also recognize that for many victims of domestic violence, the first responder is not necessarily law enforcement, because it's very frightening to call law enforcement, because that can feel like the big unknown. What's going to happen, and is this going to make things worse? For many victims of domestic violence, the first responder, the first person to find out, outside of maybe family, is your medical provider. So you're visiting your doctor, you're talking with the nurse practitioner, and they're engaging in a conversation with you, and they're discovering that things are not safe at home. Many medical providers will ask that question, are you safe? And hopefully when they're asking that, the abuser's not standing behind you.
Right.
But, and they'll find that out, and Child Inc. right now, in cooperation with the Coalition and Westside Family Healthcare and Christiana Care and St. Francis Hospital are now engaging in something called domestic violence community health workers, where when a nurse or a doctor finds out about this, they can connect the person to a community health worker who will meet with the victim anywhere at any time. Because sometimes people, you can call the hotline is a tremendous resource, but they may not know about going into a shelter. They may be really hesitant about going into a shelter, or there's no shelter beds. You just need to talk to somebody to find out what are the resources, how do I keep myself and my kids safe.
I want to go back to order protection. Someone walks in your office, they're the victim of domestic violence. They ask you to assist them with order protection. So do you go to the station? I mean, go to the police station, file a report. How long is the order protection? Is it for a month? Is it for a year? Or is it 5 years? How does that work?
Well, similar to what Sue was saying, rarely do they come into our office. We try to set up similar partnerships. So we've tried to do that with Child Inc., the YWCA, and other partners to, in the form of like a medical legal partnership to try to assist individuals who are, in abusive situations. And it depends. Isn't that the best answer from a lawyer? I'm sorry. It depends. It's really what are they looking for? Do they want, sometimes, the orders are not, we're very client-centered, so we want to take our cues from the person that wants this order. Is it going to make them more safe? Is it, the orders require relinquishment of weapons, and usually that makes people more safe, in my opinion, but sometimes an individual will say, like, I don't feel like that will make me more safe. I think that will make them very angry, and they're going to get weapons anyway. Or they can say, I want this for a year, and then I'm going to relocate somewhere else, and I don't want them to know where I am. Or it could be an order. In Delaware, you can have a lifetime protective order if the abuse is very severe. There are provisions within the order, such as custody, support for child support, and other provisions that will only last for a year unless you file something later separately.
But you have to prove the.
Yeah, you have to have unless it's agreed to by everybody. But you would have to usually have a hearing. So the process is that you would go to court, and there are mediators at the court who, if the parties aren't represented by attorneys, kind of get involved and separately talk to everybody. You don't have to be in the room unless you have the hearing with the abuser and the victim. And then the order is either agreed to, or you have a hearing in front of a judge or commissioner at family court, and then they make the decision.
Okay. Now, we mentioned children, which makes me come with the idea of learned behavior. For example, the movie Color Purple, award-winning movie. Hoppo, who played Danny Glover's son, as a child watched Danny Glover abuse Whoopi Goldberg's character verbally, emotionally, and physically. And when he became an adult, he was encouraged to put his hands on Oprah Winfrey, who played his wife. She had an answer for him. She slapped him in the eye. But how often, is there a fear? I mean, you have children. Is there ever a fear that a young man, a young boy who watches his father abuse his wife, when he gets older as a teenager and as an adult, he can say, well, you know what? This is my dad. This is what my dad did to my mom. He beat her when she disrespected him, or when she didn't do what he wanted her to do. So